Welcome to Hope Shot Recovery. I'm Sonia. I'm so glad that you can join me today. Today, we have Quinn Stone on. He is a motivational speaker, a recovery creator. He has a sober clothing merch line, and he is just an inspiration to everybody in recovery. You've probably seen him on Facebook, TikTok, or Instagram. Thank you so much for joining me today, Quinn.
Thank you so much. It's just surreal, and I really appreciate your time and giving me the platform to speak and recover out loud as I'm trying to do.
Right. I love that. So Quinn's going to tell us his story today. So let's just get started right from the beginning. So maybe you could start by telling us, what was it like in your childhood?
My childhood, my childhood was not very structured. I was born in France, and my parents divorced when I was 3 years old. My mom moved to the United States with my brother and I, and when I was about 4, and we moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. We didn't speak a word of English. We came with the backpacks that we had and the clothes that we had on, and nothing else. My mom knew a missionary. She had met a missionary, and that's why she ended up in Salt Lake. He was a really amazing guy. He was our stepfather. She married him, but turns out that they weren't able to have kids because they tried to have kids. Anyway, it didn't work out. And so they divorced. And during that time, I was trying to speak English. I was learning to speak English. I was translating for my mom, and I was attempting to go to school but I couldn't really speak English. And so I had a lot of difficulties making friends. I had an accent. I was the weird foreign kid. And growing up, there were neighborhood kids who would play with each other after school. And I started hanging around with these kids at about 6 or 7 years old. I'm sorry, about 5 or 6 years old. And it turned into a lot of like physical touching between all of the kids. And pretty soon we were all basically molesting each other. And so me being me having a language barrier, also only being like 5 or 6 years old, I felt that I tried to communicate to the adults around me, like, hey, this is what's going on, like this is what's happening, like I don't feel comfortable. And whether there was a language barrier or whether I just wasn't able to express myself, I was embarrassed. That message just didn't get communicated properly. And so I felt like it went unheard. And growing up a little bit past 7, 8 years old, I started to realize like what had happened was that we were molesting each other. Being 5 or 6, you don't really understand what's happening. uh, and I think that you know that's kind of what I tell myself is the excuse that the person had who was like running this whole thing, who's only a couple years older than me. But it was just I told myself that person was probably experiencing something really bad at home to be able to bring that kind of emotion to other kids. So I experienced the only love that I experienced at that age was really physical touch, from any kind of connection that I had. And when I started to get a little bit older, I realized that what had happened was really wrong, not only for what happened to me, but what I did to other people. And so growing up, that is more so what was like traumatic to me. It wasn't even so much like, I don't want to downplay the abuse that I went through, but I personally was more traumatized by the idea that I brought that abuse onto other people. Um, and so there was a lot of guilt and shame and worthlessness in my childhood. My mother ended up divorcing that Mormon missionary. He was in Salt Lake City. He was a Mormon missionary. Ended up divorcing him and married a guy who was an alcoholic, um, and a cokehead, and who was very abusive to her. And so I experienced domestic violence early on in the home as well. So my childhood, although it had a lot of chaotic events, I did have a really good childhood. I did have a mother who was very supportive in like what I was wanting to do. Um, when she was able to be at home, she was the best mother that she was taught to be. And I had really great times with my brother. We would go out on camping trips and do all these things. So it's not that I had a terrible childhood. I did have some instances in my childhood that were not ideal for a child, but that's something that I want to clarify, because a lot of people are like, "Oh, you must have had such a terrible childhood." It's not really that I had a terrible childhood. It's it's more so that I experienced some things that made me feel very depressed and worthless, and so my childhood was pretty depressing in itself when I was alone, but I was always searching for a relationship or a friendship or something, some happiness outside of myself, like looking for a sense of community or a sense of love or a sense of, connection outside of myself.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for your vulnerability. And I can actually relate to you a lot because I went through some things in my childhood as well. And the feelings associated with it, like the worthlessness and just searching for somebody to fill that void that was inside of me. And, also, I had a fairly decent childhood, but I went through trauma, and for me, like that trauma led to my addiction. So do you think that that is what led to your addiction as well?
I think that absolutely, it's absolutely there was uh, a hole that I was trying to fill. Like I was saying, I was constantly looking for happiness outside of myself, with through connections or relationships or whatever it is. And so when I found that dopamine rush, that feel good feeling through a substance, then I felt like I had found a way to fill that emptiness that I felt. So absolutely, it's you know, if I would have been able to find that a way to fill that emptiness besides a substance, then I probably would have done that. If I would have found that in food, or if I would have found that in being an adrenaline junkie and jumping off of like skydiving and stuff like that, I would have done that. It really just was that early on in my childhood, I saw that there was relief found in substances out of myself. My mom was a smoker. A lot of the people that I grew up with, drank around us and stuff like that. Like I said, my stepfather was an alcoholic and cokehead, so I saw him oftentimes drunk and saying things like, "Oh, I need a beer," when I'm stressed, or like, I need to smoke a cigarette. And so as a child, I started to learn that you can get relief from cigarettes, you can get relief from alcohol, you can get relief from substances. And so when I was prescribed for a surgery that I went through, I was prescribed Oxycontin, and that feeling, I got that feeling. I was like, oh, this is what everybody's talking about. This is that hole that I feel, that emptiness that I feel, that worthlessness that I feel. I can just forget about it. I don't even care. I start to just escape and be somebody else because I hated who I was. So it definitely was the reason why I continued substance abuse. Um, it's definitely why, for me personally, that coping mechanism was attractive to me. It's because I saw it being used as a coping mechanism by people around me, and I decided, oh, I can't find relief by working on myself or by having healthy coping mechanisms. I didn't know what those were. All I knew was the coping mechanisms that I was seeing growing up as a child.
Mhm. That makes so much sense. I mean, you were taught that this is how we cope with things and not taught how to cope with things in a healthy way. So, I mean, of course, that makes sense. So when you were prescribed Oxycontins from a surgery, is that where it all started for you?
Definitely. I realized that I could abuse them, and that, you know, I mean, the amount of dopamine that's released when we take substances like those are 5 to 10 times the amount of dopamine that's released when we fall in love with someone. So yeah, as a teenager, when I was given Oxycontin and it's releasing, like, all this love, which is what my brain thinks it is, but it's just dopamine and oxytocin, then my brain is like, oh, something loves me. And as a teenager who felt worthless and didn't feel loved and felt abandoned and, all these things, to me it was like, oh my goodness, I found everything I've been searching for.
Absolutely. I remember feeling exactly the same way. It was like nothing else mattered. I just
Right.
wanted more of that feeling. So, how long did they have you on these painkillers? And then afterwards, I mean, did they just like cut you off cold turkey and then you continued using?
Basically, yeah. So they gave me a 30-day prescription, and I pretty sure after the first week, or probably even the first couple of days, I didn't need it anymore. And so I just started taking more than I needed to. And pretty soon, after about 2 weeks, I had no more. And I honestly can't remember if I ended the prescription and then the next day was like in full on withdrawal and was like, oh, I need to get something, or if I had experienced withdrawal previously to running out of that prescription and being like, and then realizing like, oh, I'm hooked. But at some point, but in that time of having that prescription or shortly thereafter, like I realized like I'm sick, and I'd never experienced that before. And in fact, nobody had ever explained to me what opiate withdrawals were because I was 16. And so I'm do remember waking up, just feeling terrible, and calling my friends like, hey, like, what is going on? Like, i'm I'm about to die. Somebody needs to take me to the hospital. And them being like, yeah, dude, it's those pills. And realizing, that I'm going through withdrawals. I'm like, what are withdrawals? Oh yeah, if you're on opiates for more than, a week or so, you'll get withdrawals. And so I was like, well, I can't feel like this. I have a test. I have this. I have I was 16. I thought, the whole world was important. And so I was like, I can't be like this. So, of course, being 16 and already smoking weed and all this other stuff, I knew people who had lower tabs, and I've heard of narcos, or Valium, or I'm sorry, Vicodin and everything else. So I just got some more of those. And then I found somebody who had the Oxycontin plug, and so I started getting those. And then I started selling them because now I'm doing, a whole 80 a day at 17 years old.
Wow. And that's how it happens, right? I cannot tell you how many times I have heard that from somebody that the doctor put them on him and then they just cut him off. And then they didn't even know they were going to go into withdrawals. I mean, I've heard
Right.
that so many times. It's so irresponsible of the doctors to do that. So tell me, so you started using in your teenage years. I mean, tell me about the progression of it. When did it start to get worse where you're like, man, I got a problem and maybe I should stop?
Well, that happened many, many times. So like I mentioned, I started using, I probably started smoking weed maybe a year previous to being prescribed to Oxycontin. So I had already started experimenting with mushrooms and weed. At that point, it wasn't something, those substances weren't something that I would sell my things for, or rob somebody for, or steal from my parents, or it was more like a, if people have it, I'll throw in a couple bucks, or if people are going on some kind of a trip, then I'll go with them, and it's however much or whatever. That wasn't something that I was like, oh, I need that every single day. So I had already started experimenting with those things, and then when I found opiates, it just it was something different. It took over me, and it quickly progressed. By the time I was 18, I tried heroin for the first time. It was the summer after I graduated from high school. I tried heroin for my first time. That From that point, from when I tried heroin and realized I didn't need to spend $80 on an 80, because at this point, from when I started using Oxycontin when I was 16 to the point that I was 18, that's right when the whole Oxycontin crash happened, and they stopped producing the ones that you could shoot up and all this stuff. And so the price jumped from like 20 a piece to 80 a piece to 120 a piece, to basically, people were paying $160 for these things. And I was like, I can't do that, because my habit was already 2 or 3 a day. And so I couldn't afford $400 or $500 a day. And so I found the alternative, and I was already hooked on Oxycontin. So I figured, why not? I'm going to save a whole lot of money. And I did for maybe a month, until I was doing the same amount of money that I was spending on Oxycontin in heroin. And so it took the next 3 years. I started selling heavily, cocaine and heroin heavily. I realized that I didn't want to live like that at that moment. I wasn't. I still had. I had started forming that habit, but it wasn't quite yet the disease. My brain was getting used to doing this, but it wasn't quite yet my answer for everything. And my family was like, dude, you've got a problem. Like, you have a problem. And finally I said, yeah, you're right, I have a problem. And I tried to get sober for the first time at age 21. It was right before my 21st birthday. I got sober for a year and a half, and fell in love with this girl who was addicted to Oxy. And then I fell right back into it probably a month after dating her. Fell back into it for a couple years, and got back out. I mean, and then for the next, however long, until I was 34, it was just a roller coaster of getting clean and getting sober. I had a year and a half one time. I tried going to college and I dropped out of college because I fell back into it. I had a couple months. I went to a rehab in New York for 30 days, came back and I was relapsing the next day. So it was definitely progressive in the sense that the longer that I used, the more my brain had decided that every single action that I take, every emotion that I have, every relationship has substance abuse tied to it. And so when I get into an argument with my mom, it's because of my substance abuse. If I lose my job, it's because of substance abuse. If I drop out of high school, I'm sorry, out of college, it's because of substance abuse. And so now I hate because substance abuse. I love because substance abuse. I, am angry and depressed because of substance abuse. And now my brain has just associated substance abuse with every single area of my life, and now it's the disease. And so now I have no more control, and I have no more morals. I have, and my brain is literally just stuck in fight or flight mode that says I am in survival mode, and the only thing that's important to me right now is for me to just be alive the next 24 hours. And so I will steal from you, I will rob you, I will pull a gun, I will manipulate you, I will whatever it takes for me to be alive at the end of the day. And if that means even that I have to take your life for me to be alive at the end of the day, I will do that. And that's to me was the disease. And that's definitely to the point that it progressed for me.
I love the way that you explain that. Everything that I did was because of my substance abuse. I love
Absolutely.
because substance abuse. I hate, I mean, that makes so much sense to me. Like the lights are coming on in my head as you're explaining that, because that's where the disease is. And I remember living the same way. So, and then we're in survival mode, right? Like I
All the
get
time.
that. Yes. So tell me, so you had a couple of good runs in recovery. So what was it that you finally decided to surrender this time? Tell me about that. I've seen some of your videos, they're pretty incredible. But so tell me what it was like that made you decide to get clean this time and how you got clean this time.
So it was I mean, for me, it's not that I ever wanted to be in substance abuse. It was that I didn't know any other way to heal and to deal with my trauma, with the sexual abuse, with the domestic violence, with the emotional like trauma that I experienced. And so it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to be on drugs all the time. It's just that I didn't know how to not be on drugs all the time. And so that's why I had a couple different times where I had a year, I had 9 months sober, is because I wanted to be sober. I didn't want to be on drugs. Um, and I just didn't know how. And so for me, I guess it's because I refused to get help. I didn't want to go to any kind of rehab program. I was like, man, I got myself into this mess. I'll get myself out. I had that pride. I didn't want anybody to help me. I didn't want to admit defeat. I didn't want to ask anybody, for help, because that meant that I wasn't strong enough to do it myself. I was embarrassed and all these things. And so it was always my ego holding me back from actually getting help and actually getting some kind of tools. I was just always like, yeah, I want to get sober, but I have no idea what I'm doing. All I've learned my whole life is how to live in substance abuse. So here I am trying to get sober, but I'm just removing the substance. I'm not doing anything towards sobriety. I'm just removing the substance. And so that's why I kept falling back into it, because I had no idea what I was doing. And when I would get into some huge emotional stress, then I would be lost in how to cope with my life. And my brain would say, hey, well, substances always make you feel good. Like, oh, you just lost your job. Well, substances have always made you feel good. So I have that nagging in my head, like, oh man, I could just use right now, because I haven't built any other options, instead of my brain being like, oh man, you should really call, your best friend and talk about it, or you should call a family member and talk about it, or you should, go out and work out, or like, do some yoga, or do something important or something fulfilling. I didn't have those options. I didn't know those options existed. And so after 18 years, after going to the program in New York, after going through the 12 steps of AA and finding a higher power for myself, after learning a little bit more about how to talk about my emotions, and even getting in the routine of talking about my traumatic past, I started to heal from those things. And so it started to just become easier for me to talk about it. And I started to gain the tools that I needed to heal and actually lose the obsession of wanting to escape. I was often in situations where I didn't have a whole lot. And so the idea of sobriety wasn't super attractive to me, because it's like, well, what do I really have to lose? I'm homeless. I don't have a car. I don't have a job. I don't have a girlfriend. I don't have, family. I don't have all these things. What do I have to lose? In my mind, I didn't have a reason to get sober. And so once I was given the opportunity by my sister to actually get sober and have no responsibilities, she was like, literally just like, just be alive on my couch for a little bit. My mom and her had just gotten to the point where they had written me off as dead, because they were just waiting for that phone call, just like all of our parents and loved ones were just waiting for that phone call to be the one that's like, hey, come and identify your son. And so my mom and my sister, they're just like, man, just come and like live on the couch for a little bit and just be alive, just so that we can stop worrying about you for a week. If we know where you are, we know you're not dead. So just please, for our sake, will you just come and, get sober for like, just come and live on the couch for for however long you need to. And so my sister provided me that space, where I could get sober and have no responsibilities, so that I could start to learn like how to heal, how to really cope with my emotions. And for me personally, it took a year to get back on my feet, not even get back on my feet, but to get back to a place where I was willing to go out and get a job. I mean, if I would have gone to some kind of rehab program to teach me how to live a normal life again when I was 18, I maybe wouldn't have spent the next 18 years in addiction. But finally I took that year and started to heal myself. Started to talk about with myself and with my sister and my family about the domestic violence, about the sexual abuse, about how I felt as a child. And finally, that's what started to stick, was that I wasn't so concerned with escaping, with the obsession of escaping my past and my childhood and what I did, and started to forgive myself, to where this life in sobriety is now more attractive than this life in addiction, because now I'm starting to build. Now I have a relationship. Now I have a car. Now I have a job. Now I have dreams and passions. I have better coping mechanisms, and I have a sense of community. I have my family. I have, a following. I have all these things that I'm super grateful for. Now I look at it and I'm like, I have all these things because of my sobriety, and all these things are worth way much more to me than the obsession of escape. I think, as a recovering addict, I don't think any of us can lie. Like, for me, after 18 years, that bond had been built so strongly of using drugs as a coping mechanism that, of course, I still get triggers. I still get times where I'm like, man, I wish I could just escape this. How can I escape this? Drugs. Of course I still get those. But today I look at my life and I'm like, is this, is this escape really worth more than everything that I have to lose? And today it's just not. Today it's not worth losing everything that I have.
I love that. There's a saying that says that the goal of sobriety is to build a life that you don't need to escape from. And I'm so
Absolutely.
glad that you touched on when you first started into your sobriety journey, you're like, what do I have to lose? Because I'm sure, and I felt like this too. I mean, so many people feel like that. But, and I'm also glad that you touched on thinking about using sometimes. We need to be honest because that was a part of my life for 20 years. We think about it sometimes. It's okay to think about
Right.
it. So tell me about your recovery tools today. Tell me about what does life look like today? I know you have a great relationship with your sister because I see you guys post together sometimes, but just tell me,
Yeah.
what does it look like today?
My recovery tools today, to be honest, I've built this life that doesn't really put a whole lot of triggers in my path, if that makes sense. When I was in active addiction, it was like every single day a close friend of mine was dying. Oh, this day this person OD'd, the next day this person OD'd, the next day somebody's funeral, the next day, and it was like every single day or every single month it was like full of just, chaos. And when I got sober and I decided to completely reinvent myself and just build a new life for myself, I didn't start to build those relationships with people who were in active addiction. Obviously, I know a lot of people in active addiction. They reach out to me all the time and I have conversations and I do my best to give advice. But those people aren't my best friends. So if they pass away, I might not even hear about it because we're just messaging through a message board. But if I continue to stay in a life of chaos and stuff, it's gonna seem like my friends are still dying all the time. Why did I get sober? My friends are all still dying all the time. Well, of course, because I'm still only making friends with people who are in active addiction. So the more that I start to build a life with healthy people, who have healthy coping mechanisms, who who have healthy ways of communicating, that's how I continue to stay sober, is because the people who I surround myself with don't use substances as a coping mechanism. So to me, when I see them communicating or working out, doing yoga, um, doing things that are fulfilling to them, reading a book or expanding on some kind of knowledge, it's it's I start to pick up their mannerisms. I start to pick up their habits. I start to pick up what they do, the way they laugh, the way that they, say things, their quirks or whatever it is. I also start to pick up the way that they heal, the way that they cope with life, the way that they, you know, are able to manage themselves. And so that was huge for me, is my surroundings. That's one of my biggest coping mechanisms, is who I've surrounded myself with. Uh, Outside of that, I do a lot of things that I feel for me are self-fulfilling. It's the it doing the sound baths. To me, that's fulfilling because I feel it genuinely helps me feel better, heal. I get into like this meditative state, meditation, obviously, yoga, things, working out, things that I can physically be proud of myself for accomplishing. Taking a course on something, those are coping mechanisms that I can be proud of. Like, hey, I did this. Like, not only did I spend my hard-earned money to take this course, I complete the course and now I've learned all this stuff, I'm like, heck yeah. Now if I'm out in the forest and I need to eat and there's, and it's winter time, I know what to look for. So it's things like that, finding hobbies and like we had mentioned, building a life that's better for us, that's more attractive to us in sobriety than a life in substance abuse.
Thank you so much. I just love your story. I'm so glad that we did this tonight. So, in closing, okay, let's say that somebody's watching this video right now that is either not started their sobriety journey, or they might be in day 1, 2, 3, or where you were in the very beginning when you felt like, what do I have to lose? What would you say to that person?
I would say if I knew today, or if I knew then what I knew today, I would have gotten help. I would have gotten help early on because it was offered to me so many times. I had so many opportunities, whether it was through jail, who was like, hey, if you go and spend this time in rehab, there's so many free programs, so many free detox centers, rehab facilities. There are people who will, there are organizations that will find sponsorship funding for people to go if you actually look. And if I would have actually taken that help, like I said, to take the year to build new habits, new coping mechanisms, new whatever, if I just had taken the time that I needed early on and I would have gotten help and would have admitted to somebody that I needed help, I probably would not have spent that, the next 18 years wasting my life. I'm 35 now, and I'm sorry, 36 now. I just hit 2 years sober and I'm just building everything that I have for the first time. And if I would have done if I would have done all this when I was 18, it's just, I wasted so much time, and and it's just not worth it, because in the end I had to face it anyway to be able to live a happy, fulfilling life. And so I just feel like I wasted 18 years. And if I could go back and get help when I was 18, I would take it. So if you're out there and you're like, man, I just don't know what to do, reach out to us. If you just want somebody who's gonna like help guide you in those doors to get help, that's what we're here for. We want to help people just get inside the doors of a rehab, of a detox, of a something. Take those first steps. Just don't be afraid to ask for help, for God's sakes. Like that was my biggest thing, was pride. And it's hard to get past that.
So true. Thank you so much. Okay, so tell everybody where they can find you at. I'm also going to plug in your socials on below this video. I'll link all of his socials, but tell everybody where they can find you.
I'm most active on Facebook at Facebook.com/QS Motivation. I also have a subscription platform where I do weekly sessions. And I also have a tier on there that does, there's a live Discord. We do weekly sessions where we talk to each other. There's a community building there. There's a whole online message board with several channels. There's another tier on there where I do live meditation sound baths and guided meditations, things like that. And that's at Patreon/Quinn Stone. So also I have my TikTok, Quinn.Stone. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Quinn. And thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you back again on the Hope Shot soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.